The crowd scattered like desert quail as Florence Brewster's wagon rumbled down Fort Yuma's dusty Main Street, jeers and threats following her like vultures trailing a wounded animal. The midday California sun of 1878 beat down mercilessly as she gripped the reins with white knuckles, fighting tears that threatened to spill onto her cheeks. At 32, this wasn't the first town she'd been driven from, but the sting never lessened. Snake oil peddler. A man shouted, his voice cutting through the general clamor. Charlatan, cried a woman clutching a handkerchief to her mouth. Don't come back, or you'll get worse than words. The shopkeeper bellowed, shaking his fist with such vehemence that his spectacles nearly flew from his nose. Florence kept her chin high despite the humiliation burning through her. The brightly painted wagon emblazoned with Brewster's miraculous medicinal elixirs, in gold lettering now, seemed less a source of pride and more a target. 3 bottles shattered against the back of her wagon, their precious contents spilling into the dirt. She didn't dare look back until she'd cleared the town limits, the Colorado River gleaming in the distance. Only then did she allow herself to slow the horses and release a shuddering breath that had been trapped in her chest. This had been the worst expulsion yet, fueled by Dr. Franklin Pierce, the town physician who'd taken personal offense to her remedies and her growing customer base. Florence pulled her wagon to a halt beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree and finally permitted herself a moment of despair. She removed her small hat with trembling fingers and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "Stupid, stupid woman," she whispered to herself. "You should have left when you saw Pierce's face at your demonstration." A rustling sound startled her. Florence's hand instinctively moved to the small Derringer pistol hidden in her skirt pocket, a necessary precaution for a woman traveling alone. "Don't shoot," came a deep, gentle voice. "Just checking if you're all right, madam." Florence whirled around to find a man leading a dappled gray horse. He stood tall and lean against the harsh backdrop of the desert, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were trail-worn but clean denim trousers, a faded red shirt, and a leather vest that had seen better days. A cowboy, by the looks of him. "I'm perfectly fine," Florence replied stiffly, quickly wiping away any trace of tears. "Just resting the horses before continuing my journey." The man stepped closer, and Florence could now see his face clearly sun-browned skin, intelligent blue eyes, and a jawline shadowed with stubble. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way of city men with their pomaded hair and tailored suits, but there was something striking about him. "That's not how it looked from where I was standing," he said, tying his horse to a nearby branch and approaching with unhurried steps. "Name's Kieran Ryder. I was in town, saw what happened." Florence felt her cheeks burn with renewed humiliation. "Come to gloat, then. Or perhaps warn me about the dangers of my poisonous concoctions, as that doctor called them." Kieran Ryder shook his head, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Neither, miss. Mrs. Brewster," she corrected automatically, though she'd been a widow for over 6 years. "Florence Brewster. Mrs. Brewster," he acknowledged with a slight tip of his hat. "Actually, I came because I want to buy some of your remedies." Florence blinked at him in surprise, certain she'd misheard. "I beg your pardon, your remedies," he repeated. "I'd like to purchase some. That willow bark tincture you were selling for headaches and fever, and maybe that liniment for sore muscles." He rolled his shoulder demonstratively. "Trail riding takes its toll." Florence stared at him suspiciously. "Are you mocking me, Mr. Ryder?" "Not at all," he replied, reaching into his pocket and pulling out several coins. "I've used similar remedies before. My grandmother was Cherokee, taught me that nature provides most medicines we need if we know where to look." Florence hesitated, studying his face for any sign of deception. Finding none, she slowly moved to the back of her wagon. "The willow bark tincture is $2. The liniment is $1.50. As she climbed into the wagon to retrieve the bottles, she found herself listening for the sounds of others approaching. Perhaps this was a trap, a final humiliation orchestrated by the townspeople. But there was only the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional call of a bird. She returned with the bottles carefully wrapped in brown paper. The tincture should be taken with water, 15 drops for adults. The liniment can be applied directly to sore muscles, but avoid broken skin. Kieran nodded, accepting the package and handing over the exact amount. Their fingers brushed momentarily, and Florence was surprised by the unexpected warmth of his hand. "I believe in your remedies, Mrs. Brewster," he said quietly. "Don't let those town folks discourage you. Most of them wouldn't recognize genuine medicine if it saved their lives." "Thank you," Florence replied, uncertain how to respond to such unexpected kindness. "But I'm afraid Fort Yuma is now closed to me." "Where will you go?" he asked, genuine concern in his eyes. Florence glanced at the horizon, at the unforgiving expanse of desert and mountains. "I haven't decided. Perhaps Arizona Territory. I've heard Tucson might be welcoming." Kieran seemed to consider something, shifting his weight from one foot to another. "I'm heading to Ehrenberg, about 50 miles upriver. Small settlement but growing. No doctor there that I know of." "Folks might appreciate your remedies." Florence felt a flicker of hope, quickly tempered by caution. "Are you suggesting I follow you, Mr. Ryder? A woman alone, following a man she's just met into the wilderness," he chuckled, a warm sound that seemed strangely reassuring. "I'm suggesting you consider Ehrenberg as your next stop. The trail there is well traveled. You could join one of the freight wagons heading that way for safety. Or," he hesitated, "if you'd prefer company, I wouldn't mind traveling together. Safety in numbers, as they say." Florence studied him, this stranger who'd shown more kindness in 5 minutes than she'd received in days. Her instincts, honed by years of dealing with all manner of people, didn't sense danger from him. Still, "Why would you offer such assistance to someone you don't know?" she asked. Kieran's gaze was steady. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be judged unfairly. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "if I have another headache on the trail, I'd prefer to have the medicine seller nearby." Despite herself, Florence felt the corners of her mouth lift slightly. "I'll consider Ehrenberg, Mr. Ryder. As for traveling together—" She paused, weighing the risks against her precarious situation. "Perhaps we could travel the same trail at a respectable distance." Kieran nodded, seeming to understand her caution. "Fair enough. I plan to leave at first light tomorrow. There's a decent camping spot about a mile further along this road, near the river bend. Good water access, some shelter from the elements." "I know it," Florence replied. She'd camped there on her way to Fort Yuma weeks earlier. "Well then," Kieran said, untying his horse, "I'll bid you good evening, Mrs. Brewster. Perhaps our paths will cross again." He mounted his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. As he rode away, Florence found herself watching his retreating figure longer than necessary. When he was just a speck in the distance, she turned back to her wagon, mentally cataloging her remaining inventory. The incident in town had cost her several bottles, but she still had a decent stock. More concerning was the state of her finances. Fort Yuma had promised to be lucrative, and she'd invested heavily in ingredients. Now, with only a handful of sales to show for her time there, her reserves were dangerously low. "Ehrenberg," she murmured to herself, testing the name. She'd heard of it, a river port supporting the mines in the area. Where there were miners, there were injuries and ailments, and usually good money to be made. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Florence hitched her horses and directed them toward the camping spot Kieran had mentioned. Whether or not she'd travel with him remained undecided, but one thing was certain. She couldn't stay here, and she needed a destination. The campsite was exactly as she remembered, a sandy clearing nestled among cottonwoods and willows, with the Colorado River flowing nearby. Florence expertly positioned her wagon, unhitched her horses, and began preparing a modest supper of beans and hardtack. As darkness fell and the stars emerged in the vast desert sky, Florence sat by her small fire, a journal open on her lap. In it, she meticulously recorded her recipes, observations, and financial accounts. Tonight, the numbers were discouraging. 4 months, she whispered to the crackling flames. 4 months until I'm completely without funds. She closed the journal with a sigh and gazed into the fire. The dancing flames reminded her of another fire, years ago, when her life had changed forever. She'd been married to Thomas Brewster, a respected pharmacist in St. Louis. For 10 years, they'd built a life and a business together. Florence, with her knowledge of herbs and natural remedies passed down from her grandmother, had complemented Thomas's formal pharmaceutical education. They'd been happy, successful. Then came the fire that consumed their shop and home. Thomas had gone back in to retrieve their documentation and savings. He never emerged, left with nothing but her knowledge and a handful of salvaged ingredients. Florence had done the only thing she could think of. She'd purchased a wagon, painted it with bold promises, and taken to the road. 5 years of traveling from town to town, selling remedies that actually worked, despite the ridiculous claims she sometimes made to attract customers. It wasn't the life she'd envisioned, but it was a life she'd made her own. Now, faced with yet another setback, Florence felt the familiar weight of despair threatening to overwhelm her. But beneath it, there was something else, a spark of determination that had kept her going through loss and hardship. Ehrenberg, she said again, more decisively this time. She would go to Ehrenberg. Whether alongside Kieran Ryder or not remained to be seen. Morning came with the harsh clarity of desert sunlight. Florence awoke at dawn, prepared a quick breakfast of coffee and cold biscuits, and began packing her camp with practiced efficiency. By the time the sun had fully risen, she was ready to depart. She was adjusting the horses' harnesses when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. Kieran Ryder appeared, leading his gray horse and a packed mule. "Mrs. Brewster," he greeted with a tip of his hat. "I see you're an early riser." "The desert doesn't reward those who linger in bed, Mr. Ryder," she replied, finishing with the harnesses. "True enough," he agreed, his eyes taking in her wagon and horses with what appeared to be professional assessment. "Headed to Ehrenberg, then?" Florence nodded, straightening her simple traveling dress. "It seems as good a destination as any." "Glad to hear it," he said, and she could have sworn there was genuine pleasure in his voice. "The trail can be treacherous in places. I'd feel better knowing you weren't facing it alone." "I've managed thus far," Florence reminded him, though not unkindly. "No doubt," he acknowledged. "But even the most capable traveler can benefit from having someone watch their back in these parts." There was logic to his argument, Florence had to admit. The trail to Ehrenberg followed the Colorado River through territory known for unexpected flash floods, scorching heat, and occasional bandits. Still, she hesitated. "What is it you do, Mr. Ryder, when you're not escorting stranded medicine sellers, that is?" A smile quirked the corner of his mouth. "Primarily, I work cattle. I've been doing seasonal work at ranches from Texas to California since I was 16. Between jobs at the moment, heading to Ehrenberg to meet my brother. He's got a stake in a small ranch operation near there." It was a plausible story, and something about the straightforward way he delivered it rang true. Still, Florence had learned caution the hard way. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Ryder. Perhaps we could travel within sight of each other, at least until we're further from Fort Yuma." "Fair compromise," he agreed readily. "Shall we?" With that, their unusual partnership began. Florence drove her wagon while Kieran rode alongside or slightly ahead, occasionally disappearing to scout the trail but always returning. They maintained a respectful distance, yet Florence found his presence oddly comforting. By midday, the sun was merciless. Florence's dress clung to her back with perspiration, and she'd long since abandoned her hat in favor of a wide-brimmed sunbonnet that offered better protection. When Kieran suggested stopping near a shaded bend in the river, she agreed without hesitation. As Florence watered her horses, Kieran disappeared into the brush, returning with a handful of small yellow flowers. "Desert marigold," he said, offering them to her. "My grandmother used to make a tea from these for upset stomachs. Thought you might know other uses for them." Florence accepted the flowers with surprise. "I do, actually. They're good for skin inflammations as well." She studied him with renewed interest. "You mentioned your Cherokee grandmother taught you about natural remedies." Kieran nodded, settling on a rock near the water's edge. "She was a healer in her community before she married my grandfather, a cavalry officer. They had a complicated life together, caught between two worlds." "Yet she taught you her knowledge," Florence observed, carefully placing the marigolds in a small collection pouch. "Some of it," he confirmed. "I was interested, and my father wasn't. He wanted nothing to do with his mother's primitive superstitions, as he called them." There was an undercurrent of old pain in his voice that Florence recognized all too well. "People fear what they don't understand," she said softly, "and they particularly fear those who understand what they don't." Their eyes met in a moment of unexpected connection. "Is that why you were run out of Fort Yuma?" Kieran asked. "Fear," Florence sighed, adjusting her sunbonnet. "Partly. But mostly it was Dr. Pierce protecting his territory. He didn't appreciate a woman, especially one without formal medical training, drawing customers away from his practice." "Even though your remedies worked?" "Perhaps especially because they worked," Florence replied with a wry smile. "Nothing threatens a man's position more than being outperformed by someone he considers beneath him." Kieran's expression darkened. "I saw that doctor in town. Seemed more interested in his own importance than his patient's well-being." "A common ailment among physicians," Florence said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Though not all are so afflicted." They resumed their journey after the brief rest, traveling through terrain that grew increasingly rugged. The Colorado River remained their constant companion, a sinuous line of life cutting through the harsh landscape. As evening approached, they made camp in a natural alcove formed by weathered sandstone cliffs. Kieran built a fire while Florence prepared a simple stew from her supplies, supplemented by a rabbit he'd shot during the afternoon. They ate in companionable silence, the crackling fire and distant sound of the river filling the space between them. Florence found herself studying him surreptitiously, the way the firelight played across the angles of his face, the careful precision with which he cleaned his hunting knife after the meal, the relaxed yet alert posture that spoke of years spent in the wilderness. "May I ask you something personal, Mrs. Brewster?" Kieran broke the silence, setting aside his cleaned knife. Florence tensed slightly but nodded. "You may ask. I don't guarantee an answer." "Fair enough," he acknowledged. "I was wondering about your husband. Is he?" "Dead," Florence supplied when he hesitated. 6 years now. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she replied, poking at the fire with a stick. "He died in a fire that took our home and business in St. Louis. We were pharmacists." Kieran nodded thoughtfully. "That explains your knowledge." "But not the traveling medicine show." Florence gave a small, humorless laugh. What options does a widow with no capital have? I couldn't secure a loan to rebuild. No reputable pharmacy would hire a woman. So I took what knowledge I had, bought this wagon, and created a new life. That takes courage, Kieran said quietly, or desperation, Florence countered. Sometimes they are indistinguishable. The conversation lulled, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire burned lower. Eventually, Florence stood to prepare for sleep. I'll take first watch, Kieran offered. Wake you in a few hours. Is that necessary? Florence asked, glancing around at the seemingly empty wilderness. Probably not, he admitted. But I'd rest easier knowing someone's keeping an eye out. These parts can get unpredictable after dark. Florence nodded, appreciating his caution. Wake me when the moon reaches its zenith, she said, indicating the half-moon rising in the east. She retired to her wagon, changing behind a canvas partition into a simple nightgown and robe. Before lying down on her narrow bed, she peered out through the small window at the back of the wagon. Kieran sat by the fire, his rifle across his knees, profile etched against the flickering light. For the first time in many months, Florence fell asleep without the nagging anxiety that had become her constant companion. The journey to Ehrenberg continued for 3 more days, falling into a comfortable rhythm. They traveled by day, Kieran occasionally hunting game to supplement their supplies or pointing out useful plants to Florence, who added them to her collection when possible. On the 4th day, as they rounded a bend in the trail, Kieran suddenly raised his hand in a signal to stop. Florence pulled her wagon to a halt, sensing his tension. "What is it?" she asked in a low voice. Kieran dismounted, moving to the side of the trail where the ground was disturbed. "Tracks," he said grimly. "Several horses, moving fast, passed through here maybe an hour ago." "Travelers?" Florence suggested hopefully. Kieran shook his head, eyes scanning the surroundings. "No freight wagon marks, just horsemen riding close together. Could be nothing but—" He didn't need to finish. Both knew that in this territory, armed men riding together usually meant trouble, bandits or deserters turned outlaws. "We should proceed with caution," Kieran advised, remounting his horse. "Stay close to me and keep your derringer handy." Florence nodded, tightening her grip on the reins. They continued forward, the earlier ease of their journey replaced by watchful tension. The trail narrowed as it wound between rocky outcroppings, the river now hidden behind a line of scrubby trees. It was the perfect place for an ambush, a fact that clearly wasn't lost on Kieran, who rode with his rifle now out of its scabbard and ready. They had almost cleared the narrow pass when 3 riders emerged from behind the rocks ahead, blocking the trail. Florence felt her heart hammer against her ribs as Kieran positioned himself between her wagon and the strangers. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Kieran called, his voice casual despite the rifle laid across his saddle. The men were rough-looking, unshaven, with the hard eyes of those who lived by taking rather than making. The one in the center, wearing a battered cavalry hat that had clearly seen better days, appeared to be the leader. Well, he drawled, his gaze moving from Kieran to Florence. "What have we here? A cowboy and his lady friend. Just travelers," Kieran replied evenly. "Heading to Ehrenberg. We don't want any trouble." The leader grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Trouble has a way of finding folks in these parts, especially those carrying valuables." His eyes fixed on Florence's wagon with its painted promises of miracle cures. Like medicines, always a market for those. Florence felt a chill despite the desert heat. She'd heard stories of medicine wagons being raided for their alcohol content or opium-based remedies. "I'm afraid you'd be disappointed," she said, striving to keep her voice steady. "Most of my stock is herbal tinctures, nothing of value to anyone but the sick." "We'll be the judge of that," the leader said, nodding to his companions. One started to dismount. "That would be unwise," Kieran said, his rifle now pointed squarely at the leader's chest. "The lady's stock is her livelihood. I suggest you find your fortunes elsewhere." For a tense moment, no one moved. Florence's hand crept toward her hidden derringer, her mouth dry with fear. The leader assessed Kieran, noting his steady hands and unwavering gaze. Whatever he saw made him reconsider. "3 against 1, Cowboy," he said, though with less confidence than before. "True," Kieran acknowledged. "But you'll be the first to die. Are her medicines worth that risk?" The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the leader spat into the dirt. "Come on, boys," he grunted. "Ain't worth the powder." He turned his horse, but not before fixing Florence with a look that made her skin crawl. "Good day, medicine lady. Maybe we'll meet again when you don't have your guard dog." They rode off, disappearing around a bend in the trail. Only when the sound of their horses had faded did Kieran lower his rifle. "Are you all right?" he asked, turning to Florence, genuine concern in his eyes. She realized she was trembling, reaction setting in now that the danger had passed. "Yes," she managed. "Thanks to you." Kieran's expression was grim. "We need to keep moving. They might circle back if they think we've let our guard down." They pushed on, maintaining a faster pace despite the heat. Florence's mind kept returning to the confrontation, particularly to Kieran's unhesitating defense of her and her wagon. He'd risked his life for her, a woman he barely knew. That evening, they made camp later than usual, choosing a defensible position on higher ground with clear sightlines in all directions. Florence was uncharacteristically quiet as she prepared their meal, processing the day's events. As they ate, she finally broke the silence. "You could have been killed today." Kieran glanced up from his plate. "So could you." "Yes, but I was in danger because of my wagon and stock. You put yourself at risk for what?" "A stranger you met 4 days ago." He set down his plate, considering his words carefully. "Not a complete stranger anymore, I'd say. Besides, those men were predators. They needed stopping." "Still," Florence persisted, "most men would have looked after themselves first." "I'm not most men, Mrs. Brewster," he replied simply. Florence studied him across the fire, seeing him with new eyes. "No, I don't believe you are, Mr. Ryder." Something shifted between them in that moment, a subtle change in the atmosphere, a deepening of trust, perhaps even the first flicker of something more. "I think after today you might call me Kieran," he said with a small smile. Florence felt an answering smile touch her lips. "Then I suppose I'm Florence." They maintained their vigilance that night, taking turns at watch, though no further threats materialized. By morning, the incident had reinforced their partnership, creating a shared experience that bound them more closely than days of peaceful travel could have done. As they broke camp, Florence found herself less concerned with maintaining distance and more grateful for Kieran's presence. The road to Ehrenberg still stretched before them, but somehow the journey ahead seemed less daunting than it had before. The landscape changed gradually as they continued their journey, the terrain becoming slightly less arid as they followed the Colorado River northward. By the 6th day of travel, Florence estimated they were approximately halfway to Ehrenberg. Their routine had become comfortable sharing meals, taking turns on watch, and engaging in conversations that grew increasingly personal. Florence learned that Kieran was 34, had fought briefly in the latter part of the Civil War despite being only 17, and had spent the years since working throughout the Western Territories. He spoke of his brother Kevin with obvious affection, describing their plans to eventually build a substantial ranching operation. In turn, Florence shared more about her life with Thomas in St. Louis. Her childhood in Pennsylvania, where her grandmother had taught her about medicinal plants, and her struggles to establish herself as a traveling medicine seller. She found herself revealing details she'd kept private for years, the stillborn child she'd lost in her second year of marriage, the condescension she'd faced from male doctors, the loneliness of her wandering existence. Kieran proved to be an attentive listener, offering neither empty platitudes nor unwanted advice. Instead, he gave her the rare gift of being truly heard. On the seventh day, disaster struck without warning. They were crossing a dry wash that showed signs of recent water flow when Florence's wagon hit an unseen dip. The sudden jolt sent one wheel slamming into a partially buried rock, resulting in a sickening crack as wooden spokes splintered. "Whoa!" Florence called to her horses, pulling back hard on the reins. The wagon lurched to a stop, listing dangerously to one side. Kieran was off his horse in an instant, examining the damage. His expression told Florence everything she needed to know before he spoke. "Wheels done for," he confirmed grimly. "3 spokes completely shattered, rim cracked. It won't hold weight anymore." Florence climbed down from the driver's seat, heart sinking as she saw the extent of the damage. A broken wheel in the middle of nowhere was every wagon traveler's nightmare. "Do you have a spare?" Kieran asked, though they both knew the answer. "No," Florence replied, fighting back the wave of despair threatening to overwhelm her. "I had one, but I used it outside of Tucson last year and never had the funds to replace it." Kieran surveyed their surroundings, calculating. "We're about 20 miles from Ehrenberg, maybe a bit less." "May as well be 100 without a working wheel," Florence said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Everything I own is in that wagon. All my stock, my supplies, my personal belongings." Kieran straightened, dusting his hands on his trousers. "We'll make camp here. I'll ride ahead to Ehrenberg, see if I can find a wheelwright or at least buy a replacement wheel." Florence shook her head. "That could take days. My stock. Some of the tinctures need to be kept cool in this heat." "We don't have many options," Kieran said gently. Unless what? We could try to transfer the essentials to my packhorse and mule. Leave the wagon for now, get you and your most valuable items to Ehrenberg. Then I can come back with proper help to retrieve the wagon." It was a sensible solution, but the thought of abandoning her wagon, her home and livelihood for the past 6 years made Florence's chest tighten with anxiety. I don't know if I can leave it," she admitted. Kieran's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Florence, staying here alone with a broken wagon isn't safe. Those men we encountered could still be in the area, not to mention the heat, lack of shade." He was right, and she knew it. With reluctance, Florence nodded. "Very well. Let me sort through my things, decide what's most essential." The next hours were spent in careful triage. Florence selected her most valuable remedies and ingredients, her financial records and formulas, and the minimum of personal belongings she could manage with. Kieran reorganized his own packs to accommodate her essentials, working with quiet efficiency. As the sun began to set, they had 2 loaded animals ready for travel, with Florence's horses unhitched and prepared to be led alongside. The wagon sat forlorn in the dry wash, partially emptied but still containing items they couldn't carry. "We'll secure it as best we can," Kieran promised, using ropes to fasten the wagon's canvas cover tightly closed. "And I'll come back for it as soon as possible." Florence nodded, her throat tight as she stroked the painted side of the wagon, fingers tracing the gold lettering. It was just a vehicle, she told herself. Just wood and canvas and paint. Yet it represented everything she'd built after losing Thomas: her independence, her resilience, her second chance at life. They made camp nearby, neither suggesting they try to travel in the fading light. As night fell, Florence sat by the fire, unusually quiet, her mind circling around their predicament. "We'll get your wagon back," Kieran said softly, correctly reading her thoughts. "I promise you that." "And if we can't?" Florence asked, meeting his gaze across the flames. "If it's looted or damaged beyond repair, then you'll start again," he replied with surprising certainty. "Because that's what you do, Florence Brewster. You survive, you adapt, you rebuild." His faith in her resilience touched something deep within Florence, a chord of strength she sometimes forgot she possessed. Impulsively, she reached across the fire and squeezed his hand. "Thank you," she said simply. Kieran's fingers curled around hers, warm and calloused. "For what?" "For seeing me," she replied. "Not just the widow or the medicine seller or the woman in distress. For seeing me." In the dancing firelight, something changed in Kieran's expression, a softening, a warming. His thumb traced a gentle pattern on the back of her hand. "I've seen you from the first moment in Fort Yuma," he said, his voice low. "A woman of courage and determination, facing down a hostile crowd with her head high. How could I not see you?" Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. For a moment, they remained connected by their clasped hands, the contact communicating things neither was quite ready to put into words. Finally, with reluctance, Florence withdrew her hand. "We should rest. Tomorrow will be challenging." Kieran nodded, though his gaze lingered on her face. "I'll take first watch." As Florence prepared her bedroll, she was acutely aware of Kieran's presence nearby, solid, reassuring, increasingly necessary in ways that both comforted and unsettled her. 6 years of self-reliance had taught her to need no one. Yet here she was, dependent on this man she'd known for barely a week. More disconcerting was the realization that her feelings toward him were shifting from gratitude to something more complicated, more dangerous to her carefully constructed independence. Morning brought clarity and purpose, pushing such thoughts aside. They ate a hurried breakfast, secured their packs one final time, and set off toward Ehrenberg, with Florence riding Kieran's horse while he led the pack animals on foot. Her own horses followed, tethered to the mule. The journey was slow and arduous. The trail grew steeper and more rugged, forcing them to pick their way carefully. By midday, they'd covered perhaps 5 miles, with the sun beating down mercilessly. They paused in a small patch of shade offered by an outcropping of rock, sharing water and dried beef. "How are you holding up?" Kieran asked, his concern evident. Florence managed a tired smile. "I've endured worse, though I must admit I'm not accustomed to riding astride." "We can switch if you'd prefer to walk for a while," he offered. She shook her head. "That would only slow us further. I'll manage." As they prepared to continue, a distant sound caught their attention, the rumble of wheels and clatter of hooves. They exchanged hopeful glances. A passing wagon might mean help. Around a bend in the trail appeared a freight wagon drawn by a team of 4 mules, driven by a weathered man with a gray beard. Beside him sat a younger man, perhaps in his 20s, with a similar bearing that suggested they were related. Kieran stepped into the trail, raising his hand in greeting. "Hello there. Might we have a word?" The wagon slowed to a halt, the older man eyeing them with the wary assessment of an experienced traveler. "Afternoon," he called down. "Trouble?" "Broken wagon wheel about 5 miles back," Kieran explained. "The lady's medicine wagon. We're trying to reach Ehrenberg." The man's gaze shifted to Florence, noting her travel-worn appearance and the loaded pack animals. "Medicine seller, eh? Traveling with just the one protector?" Florence straightened in the saddle. "Mr. Ryder is escorting me to Ehrenberg after I had some difficulties in Fort Yuma." The younger man leaned forward. "You the one they ran out of town? Heard about that when we passed through yesterday. Doctor there was still bragging about it. Florence felt her cheeks burn with renewed humiliation, but she maintained her composure. I imagine he was. The older man studied them for a moment longer, then nodded as if coming to a decision. Name's Samuel Gardner. This is my son, William. We're hauling supplies to the Ehrenberg mercantile. Got space in the wagon if the lady wants to ride more comfortably. That's very kind, Florence began, but the man wasn't finished. As for your wagon, we passed Jesse Whitman and his boys about 10 miles back. They've got a repair wagon, heading to fix a broken axle at the Kofa mine. Might be willing to detour and help with your wheel. Hope surged through Florence. Could you tell us exactly where you saw them? Better than that, William spoke up. I can ride back and tell them myself. They're family friends. Pa and the cowboy here can get you and your things to Ehrenberg. Samuel nodded. Boy's right. No sense in all of us heading back. William can bring Whitman to your wagon, and I'll make sure you reach town safely. The unexpected kindness nearly overwhelmed Florence. After the hostility of Fort Yuma and the dangers of the trail, this simple offer of assistance reminded her that good people still existed in the world. We would be most grateful, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Arrangements were quickly made. William took directions to the abandoned wagon and rode back the way they'd come. Florence transferred to the freight wagon with her most delicate medicinal supplies, while Kieran followed on foot with the animals as before. Samuel Gardner proved to be a taciturn but decent man, offering Florence water from his canteen and asking polite questions about her medicines. When she mentioned her treatment for rheumatism, he admitted to suffering from the condition and purchased a bottle on the spot. My wife will be pleased, he said as he tucked the remedy into his coat pocket. She's been after me to see a doctor for years, but there ain't been one in Ehrenberg since old Doc Murphy died last winter. No physician in town at all? Florence asked, her professional interest piqued. Samuel shook his head. Nearest one's in La Paz, 20 miles upriver, too far when you're really ailing. Folks make do with home remedies and prayer. He glanced at her sideways. Reckon a medicine seller might do good business if her cures actually work. My remedies are genuine, Mr. Gardner, Florence assured him. I make no promises they can't fulfill. Good policy, he grunted approvingly. Too many snake oil peddlers in these parts, selling colored water and empty claims. By late afternoon, the distant buildings of Ehrenberg came into view, a small settlement nestled against the Colorado River. Florence felt a rush of relief at the sight. They'd made it. Samuel directed his wagon toward the town's modest mercantile, pulling to a stop in front of a 2-story wooden building with a wide porch. A man in a canvas apron emerged at the sound of their arrival. You're late, Gardner, he called good-naturedly. Expected you yesterday. Had some delays, Samuel replied, setting the brake. Brought you a bonus, though. Medicine lady and her escort lost a wheel on her wagon back yonder. The mercantile owner, a round-faced man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked at Florence with immediate interest. Medicine, you say? What kind? Before Florence could answer, Kieran stepped forward. Perhaps the lady might rest before discussing business. It's been a difficult journey. The owner nodded quickly. Of course. My apologies. Name's Herbert Wilson. My wife Martha runs the boarding house next door. She'll have a room for you, madam. Thank you, Florence said, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. But I should wait for news of my wagon. Mr. Gardner's son went to find help. I'll keep watch for them, Kieran offered. You should rest. I'll bring word as soon as I hear anything. Florence hesitated, torn between her concern for her wagon and her body's desperate need for rest. Finally, practicality won out. Very well, but please wake me immediately when there's news." The boarding house proved to be a clean, modestly appointed establishment run by Martha Wilson, a capable woman in her 50s with an efficient manner and kind eyes. She showed Florence to a small but comfortable room on the second floor. "Bathrooms at the end of the hall," she explained. "I'll have hot water brought up if you'd like to wash away the trail dust." "That would be heaven," Florence admitted, "and perhaps something to eat. I'm happy to pay." Martha waved away the offer. "Mr. Wilson mentioned you're a medicine seller. My youngest suffers terrible with monthly pains. If you've got something might help her, we can discuss a trade." Once again, Florence was struck by the unexpected kindness of strangers after the hostility she'd faced in Fort Yuma. "I have several remedies that might help. We'll talk after I've rested." True to her word, Martha sent up a large pitcher of hot water, a basin, and a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and dried apple pie. Florence washed away days of dust and grime, changed into her cleanest remaining dress, and ate with the enthusiasm of the truly hungry. Afterward, despite her intention to wait for news of her wagon, exhaustion claimed her. She lay down just for a moment and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. A gentle knocking woke her. Disoriented, Florence sat up, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. The room was dark save for moonlight streaming through the window. "Florence?" Kieran's voice came through the door. "Are you awake?" She rose quickly, smoothing her rumpled dress and hair before opening the door. Kieran stood in the hallway, hat in hand, looking as tired as she felt. "News of my wagon?" she asked immediately. He nodded, his expression reassuring. "William returned an hour ago. Whitman agreed to help. They're bringing your wagon to town, should arrive by tomorrow afternoon." The relief was so intense Florence felt her knees weaken. "Thank God," she whispered. "And the condition?" "William says Whitman thinks he can repair the wheel. Might take a couple of days, but it should be sound afterward." Kieran hesitated. "There's more. Good news, I think. Wilson, the mercantile owner, has been spreading word about you. Seems Ehrenberg is quite eager for a medicine seller. He's had several inquiries already." Florence blinked in surprise. "Already? But I haven't even set up shop." "Word travels fast in small towns," Kieran said with a small smile. "Especially when it's something folks need desperately. Wilson mentioned there's a vacant storefront you might be able to rent, if you're considering staying a while." The prospect was tantalizing. A town with no doctor, welcoming rather than hostile to her presence, with a potential permanent location rather than selling from her wagon. It was more than she dared hope for. "I'd need to see the space," she said cautiously, "and discuss terms." "Of course," Kieran agreed. "Wilson says the owner will meet with you tomorrow." He shifted slightly, seeming suddenly uncertain. "I found my brother, by the way. He's established at the ranch about 5 miles outside town." "Oh," Florence said, feeling an unexpected pang at the reminder that their paths would soon diverge. "I'm glad. That was your purpose in coming here, after all." "It was," Kieran acknowledged. "But things change, purposes evolve." There was something in his tone that made Florence look at him more closely, noting the intensity in his eyes despite his casual stance. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Kieran took a breath, as if gathering courage. "I mean that when I left Fort Yuma, finding my brother was my only goal. Now I find myself concerned with other matters as well, such as whether a certain medicine seller might find happiness in Ehrenberg, whether she might consider it home at least for a while." His voice dropped lower. "Whether she might allow a former escort to call upon her properly once she's established." Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks, her heart suddenly racing. "Kieran, you don't need to answer now," he said quickly. "It's presumptuous of me, I know. We've known each other barely a week. But he met her gaze directly. I believe in your remedies, Florence, and I find myself believing in something else too, something between us that might be worth exploring. The honesty in his words touched her deeply. For 6 years, Florence had defined herself by her independence, her ability to survive alone. Yet standing before this man who had defended her, respected her, and now offered his heart with such straightforward sincerity, she found her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Say you'll think about it," he suggested. "Say you'll at least consider Ehrenberg as more than just another stop on your journey." Florence nodded slowly. "I can promise that much." His smile was worth the small concession. "Then I'll bid you good night, Mrs. Brewster. Tomorrow promises to be a busy day for you." "Good night, Mr. Ryder," she replied, the formality a gentle step back from the intimacy of the moment. As she closed the door and returned to her bed, Florence found her mind too full for sleep. The events of the past week played through her thoughts: the humiliation in Fort Yuma, the unexpected alliance with Kieran, the dangers and mishaps of the journey, and now this potential new beginning in Ehrenberg. And beneath it all, the unsettling awareness that Kieran Ryder had somehow breached defenses she'd thought impenetrable, awakening feelings she'd believed long buried with Thomas. Morning brought clarity, as it often did. Florence rose early, dressed in her most respectable attire, a navy blue dress with minimal travel wear, and arranged her hair carefully. If she was to meet with potential landlords and customers, she needed to present herself as a professional, not a travel-worn vagabond. Martha Wilson provided a hearty breakfast and valuable information about Ehrenberg, its population, approximately 600 souls, economy, primarily supporting river traffic and nearby mining operations, and social dynamics, a respectable core of families surrounded by the usual frontier elements. "Town's been desperate for medical care since Doc Murphy passed," Martha confirmed, pouring coffee. "His widow sold his supplies and equipment to a doctor in Yuma, so there's nothing left of his practice. Folks have been traveling to La Paz for serious matters, but it's far, especially for the elderly or very ill." "I'm not a physician," Florence felt compelled to clarify. "I sell remedies, but I don't perform surgery or set complex fractures." Martha nodded, understanding. "Still more than we have now. And I suspect you know more about treating everyday ailments than you let on. Women like us often do." There was a knowing look in Martha's eyes that Florence recognized, the shared understanding of women who'd learned to navigate a man's world by sometimes diminishing their own knowledge and capabilities. After breakfast, Herbert Wilson arrived to escort Florence to the vacant storefront. Kieran appeared as they were leaving, offering to accompany them. Florence accepted, grateful for his familiar presence as she contemplated this potential new chapter. The available space was on the main street, a modest storefront with living quarters in the rear. It had previously housed a cobbler who had relocated to Phoenix. The owner, a thin, precise man named Edward Harrington, explained the terms: rent payable monthly, tenant responsible for minor repairs, 6-month minimum commitment. "It would need some modifications for my purposes," Florence observed, envisioning shelving for her remedies, a counter for preparations, perhaps a screened area for consultations, and thorough cleaning. "Previous tenant left it tidy," Harrington responded, slightly offended. "But you're welcome to make changes, long as they don't damage the structure." The rent was reasonable, lower than Florence had paid for temporary setups in larger towns. Still, she hesitated, the commitment of 6 months feeling momentous after years of constant movement. "May I have until tomorrow to decide?" she asked. I'd like to see my wagon safely returned first. Harrington agreed, though somewhat reluctantly. As they left, Florence noticed a small gathering of people had assembled outside, watching with undisguised curiosity. "Word spread," Wilson murmured to her. "These folks are hoping you'll set up shop." Florence straightened her shoulders and approached the group. "Good morning," she greeted them. "I understand you've heard I sell medicines." A middle-aged woman stepped forward, hands twisting her apron. "My husband has the miner's cough, something terrible. Doctor in La Paz says it's consumption, but we can't afford his treatments. Do you have anything that might ease his breathing?" Before Florence could answer, others chimed in with their ailments: arthritis, female complaints, children's fevers, toothaches. The list went on, a litany of suffering that any frontier town endured, usually in stoic silence. Florence raised her hands for quiet. "I don't have my full stock with me at present, as my wagon is being repaired. But it should arrive today, and I do have some remedies with me. If you'll allow me time to organize, I could perhaps see a few of you this afternoon at the boarding house." The crowd murmured approval. Florence continued, "I make no false promises. Some conditions are beyond the help of Remedies, but I will do what I can for those I can assist." As the group dispersed, Florence felt Kieran's presence beside her. "You've given them hope," he said quietly. "That's worth something, even before you've sold a single bottle." "Hope can be dangerous when misplaced," she replied. "I don't want to build expectations I can't fulfill." "You're honest about your limitations," Kieran observed. "That's more than most medicine sellers or doctors, for that matter." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of William Gardner, riding hard into town. He pulled his horse to a stop before them, dust billowing. "Wagon's coming," he announced, slightly breathless. "About 2 miles out." "Whitman got the wheel temporarily fixed enough to travel, but it'll need proper repair here." Florence felt a surge of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, William. I'm in your debt." The young man dismounted, grinning. "Pa says to tell you he used your rheumatism medicine. Says his knees haven't felt this good in years." "I'm glad to hear it," Florence replied, genuinely pleased. "Please tell him the effects will improve with regular use." William nodded. "He'll be happy to hear that. Ma's already asking if you have something for her headaches." "I do indeed," Florence assured him. "Once my wagon arrives, I'll prepare a remedy for her." The arrival of Florence's wagon an hour later drew a small crowd of onlookers. Jesse Whitman, a burly man with enormous hands and a blacksmith's build, had indeed managed a temporary repair that allowed the wagon to travel, though it still listed noticeably to one side. "Need to rebuild this wheel proper," he announced after a thorough examination. "Can do it, but it'll take 2 days at least. Got other work backed up at the forge." "I understand," Florence said, relieved that repair was possible. "I'm grateful for your assistance in bringing it to town." Whitman named his price for the repair steep, but not unreasonable given the circumstances. Florence agreed, mentally calculating her dwindling funds. She would need to sell a significant amount of remedies to recoup the expense. With the wagon safely delivered to Whitman's smithy, Florence set about retrieving essential items to conduct limited business from the boarding house. Martha Wilson generously offered the use of her parlor for the afternoon, an arrangement that proved beneficial to both women when Florence successfully treated Martha's daughter's menstrual pains with a special blend of cramp bark and valerian tincture. By evening, Florence had seen 15 patients and sold remedies worth more than twice Whitman's repair fee. The word of her arrival had spread beyond Ehrenberg proper to outlying ranches and mining camps, carried by travelers and passing riverboats. As she counted her earnings and updated her ledger that night, Florence found herself contemplating the storefront with increasing seriousness. There was clearly demand for her services here, and the reception had been overwhelmingly positive, a stark contrast to her experience in Fort Yuma. A knock at her door revealed Kieran, come to inquire about her day and share news of his brother's ranch. He listened attentively as Florence recounted her patience and sales, his genuine interest in her work touching her deeply. "You've made quite an impression," he observed. "Wilson says there hasn't been this much excitement in town since the silver strike at the Monument Mine last year. People are desperate for care," Florence replied, sobered by what she'd seen that day. "There's so much suffering that could be alleviated with proper treatment and medicines." "Are you considering Harrington's offer then?" Kieran asked, his tone carefully neutral though his eyes betrayed his hope. Florence hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I think I am. At least for the 6 months. It would be a change staying in one place that long." "A good change, perhaps," Kieran suggested. "Perhaps," she agreed, meeting his gaze. "There are several aspects of Ehrenberg that recommend it." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken meaning. Kieran took a step closer, then stopped himself, maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm glad," he said simply. "My brother has invited us both to dinner tomorrow evening if you're amenable. He's curious to meet the medicine lady who's caused such a stir." Florence smiled. "I'd be delighted. It's been some time since I've enjoyed proper hospitality." "Good," Kieran replied, his answering smile warming his entire face. "I'll call for you at 6 if that suits." When he had gone, Florence stood at her window, gazing out at the lamplit street of Ehrenberg. A week ago, she'd been fleeing Fort Yuma in disgrace, her future uncertain and her prospects dim. Now she contemplated not just temporary refuge but possibly something more permanent, a base for her business, a community that welcomed her services, and perhaps even. She turned from the window, unwilling to follow that thought to its conclusion just yet. One step at a time, she reminded herself. First the shop, then considerations of the heart. The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Florence signed the lease on the storefront, invested in basic furnishings, and began transforming the space into a proper apothecary. Whitman completed the wagon repair ahead of schedule, impressed by Florence's remedy for his wife's chronic indigestion. With her wagon operational again, Florence was able to transfer her entire stock to the new shop, organizing her remedies and raw ingredients with meticulous care. Throughout this transition, Kieran was a constant presence, helping move heavy furniture, offering practical suggestions for the shop layout, and introducing Florence to key members of the community. His support was invaluable, yet scrupulously respectful of her independence. The dinner at his brother's ranch revealed another side of Kieran. Kieran Ryder proved to be a more reserved version of his brother, equally kind but less outgoing. His wife Sarah, however, welcomed Florence with open arms, clearly delighted to have another educated woman in the vicinity. As they toured the modest but growing ranch, Florence observed the easy camaraderie between the brothers, the way they communicated with minimal words yet perfect understanding. It was evident that they shared not just blood but a vision, a dream of building something lasting in this harsh frontier. "Kevin came out first, secured the land," Kieran explained as they walked the property. "I've been sending what funds I could from my work elsewhere. Now that I'm here, we'll expand faster." "It's impressive what you've accomplished already," Florence remarked, noting the solid construction of the main house and barn, the healthy appearance of the small herd of cattle. "Ryder men are builders," Sarah said with obvious pride. "What they set their minds to, they achieve." The comment lingered in Florence's thoughts as they returned to town that evening, the desert night cool around them. Kieran drove the wagon with confidence, the horses picking their way carefully along the moonlit road. "Your brother has created something admirable," Florence said, breaking the comfortable silence. "He has," Kieran agreed, "though it hasn't been easy. The first 2 years nearly broke him: drought, cattle thieves, poor market prices, but he persevered." "As you will too," Florence observed. "Now that you've joined him." Kieran glanced at her, his expression thoughtful in the moonlight. "That's the plan, though plans can change when new considerations arise." "Such as?" He smiled slightly. "Such as finding oneself reluctant to be 5 miles from town when there are compelling reasons to remain closer." The implication warmed Florence even as it unsettled her carefully maintained equilibrium. "Kieran," she began, then hesitated, unsure how to proceed. "You don't need to say anything," he assured her. "I understand this is a time of transition for you. Establishing your business must be your priority." His consideration only endeared him to her further. "It's not just that," Florence admitted. "After Thomas died, I determined never to be dependent on anyone again. My life as a traveling medicine seller has been difficult, but it's been mine, my choices, my successes, my failures." Kieran nodded, his hands steady on the reins. "I respect that independence. It's part of what I admire about you." "But," Florence prompted, hearing the unspoken qualifier, "but independence doesn't have to mean isolation," he said gently. "There's a difference between relying on someone and choosing to share your life with them." The words resonated deeply with Florence, articulating a distinction she'd never fully considered. Before she could respond, they arrived at the boarding house, where she was still staying until the living quarters behind her shop were properly prepared. Kieran helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and sure at her waist. As her feet touched the ground, he didn't immediately release her, and Florence found herself not wanting him to. "Thank you for a lovely evening," she said, looking up at him in the lamplight spilling from the boarding house windows. "It was my pleasure," he replied, his voice low. His gaze dropped briefly to her lips, then returned to her eyes, a question in them that needed no words. Florence felt her heart quicken, awareness of his proximity suddenly acute. 6 years since she'd been held by a man, since she'd felt the warmth of someone who cared for her. She swayed slightly toward him, a nearly imperceptible movement, but it was answer enough. Kieran bent his head and brushed his lips against hers, gentle, questioning, brief. A first kiss so tender it brought unexpected tears to her eyes. When he drew back, his expression was a mixture of wonder and concern. "Florence, did I misread?" "No," she whispered, finding her voice. "No, you didn't misread anything." Relief softened his features. "Good," he murmured, "because I've been wanting to do that since Fort Yuma." Florence smiled, her hand coming to rest lightly on his chest. "Since Fort Yuma, when I was being run out of town in disgrace." "Especially then," he confirmed. "You were magnificent, proud, and defiant despite everything. I knew then you were someone exceptional." The compliment warmed her, but Florence felt compelled to maintain some perspective. "This is still very new, Kieran. I'm still establishing myself here." "I can't rush into anything," he finished for her. "I understand. I'm not asking for commitments or promises, just permission to court you properly now that you're settling in Ehrenberg." The old-fashioned request, delivered with such sincere respect, charmed her completely. "I think I would like that," Florence admitted. His smile in response was radiant. "Then I'll bid you good night, Mrs. Brewster, and call on you tomorrow. Perhaps I might escort you to Sunday services. The town's reverend is eager to meet you." "I'd be delighted," Florence replied, finding herself reluctant to end the evening despite her earlier reservations. Their parting was brief, but charged with new awareness. Kieran's hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary, before he returned to his wagon. Florence watched him drive away, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The following weeks established new patterns and rhythms in Florence's life. Her shop, which she named Brewster's Remedies and Apothecary, in a nod to her more respectable establishment, flourished beyond her expectations. The people of Ehrenberg and surrounding areas eagerly sought her treatments, from miners with respiratory ailments to ranch wives with household injuries. Florence quickly realized she was providing more than just remedies. She was offering medical consultation, wellness advice, and sometimes simply a sympathetic ear. Her formal training might be limited compared to university-educated doctors, but her practical knowledge and genuine care for her patients earned their trust and loyalty. True to his word, Kieran courted her with respectful persistence. He called regularly at her shop, often bringing small gifts, wildflowers, a book of poetry he'd found at Wilson's Mercantile, once a beautiful carved wooden box for her herbs that he'd made himself. They attended church together on Sundays, shared meals at the town's small restaurant, and occasionally rode to visit Kevin and Sarah at the ranch. Through it all, Kieran never pressured Florence or attempted to infringe upon her independence. He seemed to understand instinctively that her business and self-sufficiency were precious to her, not obstacles to be overcome but essential parts of who she was. As autumn approached, bringing slightly cooler temperatures to the desert landscape, Florence found herself looking forward to Kieran's visits with increasing anticipation. Their conversations ranged from practical matters of the day to deeper discussions of hopes and dreams, fears and regrets. In him, she found not just a potential suitor but a true companion, someone who challenged her thinking, respected her opinions, and made her laugh with his dry, understated humor. The physical aspect of their relationship progressed with delicate restraint. Kisses goodnight became more frequent and less hesitant, sometimes lingering until both pulled away breathless. Kieran's touch a hand at her waist, fingers intertwined with hers, a brush of his lips against her temple became familiar and cherished. For Florence, who had resigned herself to a life without such tenderness, these developments were both thrilling and frightening. Opening her heart meant risking pain, a prospect that had kept her emotional walls high for 6 long years. One evening in late September, Kieran invited Florence for a ride along the river at sunset. The Colorado glowed golden in the fading light as they walked their horses side by side, the town receding behind them. "I have news," Kieran said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Kevin and I have secured the adjacent property. It doubles our acreage." "That's wonderful," Florence replied, genuinely pleased for him. "Your hard work is paying off," Kieran nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It means building for the future, committing to this place long term." He glanced at her. "How are you finding Ehrenberg now that you've been here almost 3 months?" Florence considered the question. "Better than I expected," she admitted. "The business is thriving. I'm actually considering taking on an assistant. Martha Wilson's daughter has shown interest and aptitude." "And beyond the business?" Kieran asked carefully. Florence met his gaze, understanding the real question. "I've found community here, acceptance, things I'd stopped expecting in my travels." She paused. "And I've found you." Kieran reined his horse to a stop, Florence doing the same. In the golden light, his eyes were intensely blue as they searched her face. "Florence," he said, his voice low and serious, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, without concern for my feelings." Her heart quickened, apprehension and anticipation mingling. "What is it? Are you happy here?" he asked simply. "Not just content or making the best of things, but truly happy." The question caught her off guard with its directness. Florence took a moment to consider, wanting to give him the honest answer he requested. "Yes," she finally said, the truth of it resonating through her. "I am happy here, happier than I've been since before Thomas died." Relief and joy transformed Kieran's features. He dismounted and came to help her down from her horse, his hands gentle at her waist. When her feet touched the ground, he didn't step back, instead drawing her closer. "I love you, Florence," he said, the words flowing naturally, as if he'd been waiting to speak them for a long time. "I believe I started falling in love with you that first day in Fort Yuma, when you held your head high despite everything. Every day since has only deepened those feelings." Florence felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected emotion welling up. "Kieran, you don't need to say anything now," he assured her, one hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. "I just wanted you to know, whatever you decide about your future, whether it includes me or not, I will support you." The declaration, delivered with such sincerity and respect for her autonomy, broke through Florence's final reservations. The walls she'd built around her heart after Thomas's death, walls that had protected but also isolated her, crumbled completely. "I love you too," she whispered, the words both frightening and liberating. "I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself, afraid of being vulnerable again, of potentially losing someone else I care for." "I understand fear," Kieran said softly. "But I've learned that the things most worth having in life require risk." His thumb gently traced the curve of her cheek. "You're worth any risk, Florence Brewster." In the golden light of sunset, with the river flowing beside them and the desert stretching vast and beautiful around them, they sealed their declarations with a kiss that held both tenderness and promise, a beginning rather than an ending. The following weeks brought a new dimension to their relationship. Having acknowledged their love for each other, Florence and Kieran began discussing their future more concretely. The expansion of the Ryder Ranch meant increased responsibilities for Kieran, while Florence's apothecary continued to flourish, especially after she hired young Amanda Wilson as her assistant and apprentice. "I've been thinking," Kieran said one evening as they sat on the small porch behind Florence's shop, watching the stars emerge. "The town is growing. There's talk of a proper hotel being built next spring." "I've heard," Florence replied. "Mr. Wilson says the mining companies are considering Ehrenberg as a major supply depot for their operations." Kieran nodded, "which means more people, more opportunities, and more need for medical care." He turned to face her more directly. "Have you ever considered expanding your practice? Perhaps taking on a more formal healing role?" Florence raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting I present myself as a doctor? I don't have the credentials, Kieran." "Not a doctor in name, perhaps," he acknowledged, "but in function. Florence, you're already doing more than selling remedies. You're diagnosing ailments, recommending treatments, even performing minor procedures. I watched you set Mrs. Johnson's broken wrist last week with more skill than many doctors I've seen." It was true. Florence had found herself drawn into increasingly complex medical situations as the only person with relevant knowledge in the area. She'd assisted with childbirths, treated serious infections, even extracted an abscessed tooth when the traveling dentist's visit was still weeks away. "I've been cautious about overstepping," she said thoughtfully. "Without formal training, there are limits to what I should attempt." "Of course," Kieran agreed, "but you could expand your knowledge. There are medical texts, journals, and perhaps even formal training eventually if you desired it. Some medical colleges back east have begun accepting women." The suggestion was both exciting and daunting. "That would require travel, extended absence." "Yes," Kieran said, taking her hand, "but if it's something you want, we could make it work." The casual "we" wasn't lost on Florence. "Are you proposing a particular arrangement, Mr. Ryder?" she asked, a smile playing at her lips despite the seriousness of the conversation. Kieran's expression softened, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of her hand. "Not at this exact moment," he replied with answering humor. "When I propose marriage to you, Florence Brewster, it will be a properly planned occasion, not a hypothetical discussion on your porch." The mention of marriage, even in this light-hearted context, sent a flutter through Florence's chest. The prospect no longer terrified her as it might have months earlier. Instead, she found herself imagining a future with Kieran, a partnership of equals, each pursuing their own passion while supporting the other. "I would consider such a proposal carefully," she said, her tone serious though her eyes held warmth. "Especially if it came from a certain rancher with a remarkable understanding of independent women." Kieran's smile deepened, his eyes reflecting starlight. "I'll keep that in mind." As autumn gave way to winter, the desert temperatures cooled considerably. Business at the apothecary slowed somewhat with the seasonal change, giving Florence more time for research and preparation of complex remedies. She'd ordered medical texts from San Francisco and eagerly absorbed their contents, expanding her knowledge of anatomy, physiology, and treatment protocols. Kieran divided his time between the ranch and town, often staying at the boarding house when ranch work kept him in Ehrenberg past sunset. His brother and sister-in-law became frequent visitors to town as well, with Sarah particularly enjoying the female companionship Florence provided in this largely male-dominated frontier. It was Sarah who first noticed the subtle changes in Florence's appearance and energy as December approached: the slight pallor, the occasional queasiness in the mornings, the uncharacteristic fatigue in the afternoons. "Have you considered," Sarah asked carefully one afternoon as they shared tea in Florence's living quarters, "that your symptoms might indicate a particular condition?" Florence set down her teacup, her hand suddenly unsteady. "I've considered it," she admitted quietly. "My courses are 2 weeks late." Sarah reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "How do you feel about the possibility?" It was a complex question. At 32, Florence had long ago resigned herself to childlessness after the stillbirth during her marriage to Thomas. The prospect of pregnancy now unmarried, despite her established position in the community, brought both joy and anxiety. "I'm afraid to hope," she confessed, "and yet I find myself hoping desperately." "Have you told Kieran?" Florence shook her head. "Not until I'm certain. It could simply be strain or irregular cycles. I've experienced those before during times of change." Sarah's expression was sympathetic but practical. "You should know soon enough, and Florence, Kieran would be overjoyed. You know that, don't you?" "I believe he would," Florence agreed. "But it would change everything." "Life has a way of doing that," Sarah said wisely, "sometimes for the better." A week later, Florence could no longer deny the evidence of her condition. The morning sickness, the tenderness in her breasts, the continued absence of her monthly cycle all pointed to a pregnancy approximately 2 months advanced. Her emotions fluctuated between elation and terror, often within the same hour. She knew she needed to tell Kieran, but finding the right moment proved challenging. The ranch demanded more of his time as winter preparations continued, and their moments alone together were precious but brief. An unexpected opportunity arose when a December snowstorm, rare but not unprecedented in this part of Arizona territory, swept through the region, blanketing Ehrenberg in several inches of white. The sudden weather forced Kieran to remain in town overnight, as the trail to the ranch became temporarily impassable. Florence invited him to dinner in her quarters behind the shop, a cozy space she'd transformed with simple touches: curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the bed, shelves lined with books and personal mementos. She prepared a special meal of beef stew and fresh bread, setting the small table with her best dishes. Kieran arrived bearing a gift, a beautiful woolen shawl in deep blue. "Saw it on the riverboat merchant last week," he explained as Florence draped it around her shoulders, admiring the fine weave. "Thought the color matched your eyes." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Florence deeply. They enjoyed their meal together, discussing the storm's impact on the town and ranch, sharing news and observations as they always did. But beneath the normal conversation, Florence felt her nerves mounting as the moment of revelation approached. As they finished the apple tart she'd made for dessert, Kieran noticed her unusual quietness. "Is everything all right, Florence? You seem preoccupied." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Kieran, there's something I need to tell you, something important." His expression grew serious, attuned to her tone. "I'm listening." Florence folded her hands in her lap to stop their trembling. "I'm with child. About 2 months along, by my calculation." For a moment, Kieran simply stared at her, processing her words. Then a series of emotions crossed his face in rapid succession: surprise, wonder, joy, settling finally into an expression of such pure happiness that it brought tears to Florence's eyes. "A child," he repeated, his voice filled with awe. "Our child." Florence nodded, emotion closing her throat momentarily. "Yes." In one fluid movement, Kieran was out of his chair and kneeling beside hers, taking her hands in his. "Florence," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I was planning to ask you this at Christmas, had a whole evening arranged with Kevin and Sarah's help. But I find I can't wait another moment." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch, from which he produced a ring, a delicate gold band set with a single small diamond flanked by 2 tiny sapphires. "I love you," he said simply. "I love your strength, your knowledge, your compassion, your independence. I want to build a life with you, to support your dreams as you support mine. Will you marry me, Florence Brewster?" Tears spilled freely down Florence's cheeks now, joy overwhelming her. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Kieran Ryder." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her into his arms, holding her with infinite tenderness, as if she were made of precious glass. When their lips met, the kiss held all the promise of their future together: partnership, passion, and the new life growing within her. They were married 2 weeks later in Ehrenberg's small church, a simple ceremony attended by the community that had embraced Florence so completely. Martha Wilson helped with wedding preparations, while Sarah stood as Florence's matron of honor. Kevin served as his brother's best man, his typically reserved demeanor giving way to genuine happiness for the couple. Florence wore a new dress of deep green velvet, an extravagance ordered from the riverboat merchant, with her mother's cameo at her throat, and Kieran's blue shawl around her shoulders. As they spoke their vows before Reverend Thompson, Florence felt the last vestiges of her past grief and isolation dissolve, replaced by the certainty that she had found not just love but a true home. The community celebrated with a reception at Wilson's Mercantile, transformed for the occasion with evergreen boughs and candles. There was music from local musicians, dancing, and a feast contributed to by many households. Florence, still in the early stages of pregnancy and not yet showing, accepted congratulations with radiant happiness, Kieran constantly at her side. "Have you decided where you'll live?" Martha Wilson asked as the celebration continued around them. "The ranch or above the shop?" It was a practical question that Florence and Kieran had discussed extensively. Their solution reflected the partnership they were building. "Both," For now, Florence explained. I'll maintain the apothecary and our quarters here in town, while Kieran continues developing the ranch with Kevin. Eventually, we'll build a proper home at the ranch, but close enough to town that I can still serve patients. And the baby? Martha inquired gently. Florence smiled, her hand unconsciously moving to her still flat abdomen. The baby will have the best of both worlds, the freedom and beauty of ranch life, and the community of town. The practical arrangement reflected their commitment to honoring both their individual paths and their shared journey, neither sacrificing their passion or purpose for the other, but finding ways to interweave their lives. As winter gave way to spring, Florence's pregnancy progressed without complications. Her body changed, the new roundness of her figure a daily reminder of the life growing within. She continued working at the apothecary, though Amanda took on more responsibilities as Florence's energy fluctuated. Kieran proved to be an attentive and protective husband, perhaps overly so at times, prompting occasional good-natured arguments when Florence felt his concern becoming restrictive. Yet even in disagreement, they maintained their fundamental respect for each other's perspectives, always finding compromise through honest communication. By summer, the ranch had expanded further, with a new house under construction near the main road to town. A thoughtfully designed home with space for Kieran and Florence's growing family, positioned to allow Florence reasonable access to her patients while providing the open space and fresh air both desired for their child. As her due date approached in early August, Florence felt a serenity she hadn't expected. Despite her medical knowledge, or perhaps because of it, she had anticipated more anxiety about the birth. Instead, she found herself filled with quiet confidence, supported by Sarah's practical experience as a mother of two, Martha Wilson's grandmotherly wisdom, and Kieran's unwavering faith in her strength. The baby arrived on a scorching August afternoon, after nearly 15 hours of labor. Florence had prepared the birthing room herself, instructing Amanda and Sarah on her preferred arrangements and necessary supplies. Kieran remained nearby throughout, though tradition kept him from the birthing room itself until the final moments. When the first cry pierced the air, strong, indignant, vital, Florence felt tears of joy stream down her face. Sarah placed the squirming, red-faced infant on her chest. "You have a son," she announced, her own eyes damp. "A beautiful, healthy boy." Florence gazed down at her child in wonder, counting fingers and toes, noting the tuft of dark hair that promised to be like his father's. When Kieran was finally permitted to enter, his face reflected the same awestruck joy she felt. "He's perfect," he whispered, carefully sitting on the edge of the bed, one gentle hand touching their son's tiny head. Just like his mother. They named him Thomas Kieran Ryder, honoring Florence's first husband while looking toward their future. The residents of Ehrenberg celebrated the birth as a community event, bringing gifts and well wishes to the new family. Even Dr. Pierce from Fort Yuma, hearing of the successful apothecary established by the woman he'd once denounced, sent a begrudgingly respectful note of congratulation. As summer faded into autumn once more, Florence stood on the porch of their newly completed ranch house, baby Thomas sleeping against her shoulder in the cool evening air. The setting sun painted the desert in shades of gold and rose, the same colors that had surrounded them a year earlier when they first declared their love. Kieran joined her, fresh from the day's work, his arm slipping around her waist as he pressed a kiss to her temple. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly, careful not to wake their son. Florence leaned into his embrace, contemplating the question. "I'm thinking about journeys," she said finally. "How the most difficult paths sometimes lead to the most unexpected destinations." Kieran nodded, his gaze moving from the sleeping infant to the thriving ranch before them, to the distant lights of Ehrenberg, where Florence's apothecary continued to serve the community. When I said I believed in your remedies that day in Fort Yuma, I never imagined where that simple statement would lead. Nor did I, Florence admitted. I was too busy feeling humiliated and defeated to recognize a new beginning. Life has a way of surprising us, Kieran observed, his arm tightening around her waist. Florence turned to him, her free hand coming up to touch his face with tender familiarity. Indeed it does, and I've never been more grateful for its surprises. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Florence reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here from the tragedy of Thomas's death, through years of solitary wandering, to the moment of deepest humiliation in Fort Yuma that had, improbably, led to her greatest happiness. The patent medicine seller who'd been run out of town had found not just a new start but a true home, a loving husband who believed in her, a community that valued her, and now a child to carry their shared legacy forward. Not an ending, Florence thought as she gazed at her family and home, but rather the most perfect of beginnings.